Hi JD, so thanks for your video. Once again, I've spent like 2 hours making this one and just really engaged with all the questions that you raised and the comments that you've made. And I think I agree with everything that you said. I think we haven't settled the problem of like being moral evaluators of God's behavior. And I would say that the reason why I don't consider us moral evaluators of God's behavior is because I think humanity is incredibly incapable of taking any kind of moral high ground in our present state. To me, the question of can we evaluate God's behavior at a moral level often comes from a place of we know what is good and bad, and when we see God doing bad things, we should be able to say so. I don't start from the assumption of we know what is good and bad. We try and fail, and it's good to try, even though we know that ultimately we will fail because we're human beings. And it's good to try to figure out what good is and to pursue it. The Torah presents us with the model of Aaron and calls him in Hebrew a rodef shalom, a one who pursued peace or wholeness, literally. I think that's a really good model for human beings. We should be pursuing peace. We should be pursuing wholeness. We should stand on the side of mercy as much as possible. And doing that will lead us into an understanding of what is good over time, but it's not actually attainable. And so we don't have a moral high ground to stand on in order to look down and evaluate God. Such a thing is also like not possible in the philosophical frameworks that Christianity and Judaism particularly rely on, at least not in sort of the classical theologies of those religions. There are liberal Christians and Jews who would say we absolutely can evaluate God's behavior and not be happy with it. I'm just not one such person that believes that. I think what I see in both Jewish and Christian teaching traditionally is a sort of reality check that if I'm perceiving something that God is doing to be wrong, that means there is something in my perception that is missing. Now, it does not mean that whatever somebody says God is doing is right. It does not mean that whatever my priest says is true. It does not mean that whatever the church declares unconditionally is the good work of God. I call myself a Catholic a lot, but that's probably what makes me a Protestant. I really believe in the tradition of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and my devotional life looks very Roman Catholic, actually. But the notion that anything that the Pope says is true and that it has supreme authority over the rest of the church just doesn't fly with me. So when I'm talking about evaluating God's behavior, I'm not talking about evaluating things human beings do that they claim are for God. Because as soon as human beings are doing anything, it's gonna be messy. So I want to be really clear that I don't have a belief in the sort of total goodness of God that excuses human beings from doing bad things. But I do have a belief in the total goodness of God that no matter what happens to me, God is always drawing me into God. And that God will take everything that happens in my life and turn it into something good. That doesn't mean that everything that happens to me is good. It means that God is so powerful and merciful that God can take literally anything, including my death, and turn it into a saving grace. My belief in God's goodness doesn't so much come from this idea that like God can do whatever he wants and like we just have to deal with it. It comes from a stubborn belief and hopefulness that that God is really working toward our good in life. It comes from the encounters with God that I have had both personally and in community that show me that despite all of my horrible, traumatic religious experiences in the past, God is always taking those things and redeeming them. And to me, that stubbornness is not really a submission. It's a divine insistence that God has the final say. My resistance to seeing the bad things that have happened to me in the past as God's moral failings is radically revolutionary, I think, because it acknowledges that where human powers have interfered, I have been harmed. But where God's power has triumphed, which is everywhere, I have been saved. And I don't just mean spiritually. There are a few times in my life where I think God has saved me physically from death. So, yes, I do believe that God gives us agency to hand it back, that God gives us free will to sacrifice it back to God. I do also believe that that will ultimately make us the most happy and the most whole and the most healthy. But some people have used that idea to get people to submit to human authorities, and that's not what I think that idea is for. There are situations in which I believe that human beings have been given authority to which we ought to be obedient. But it's not this absolute kind of obedience, this submission of the will that we owe to God. In fact, when we submit fully to God, we become invincible to human power. What can man do to me? Go watch The Prince of Egypt. It's like one of my favorite movies of all time. It's probably one of the best movies that's ever been made. Moses has this little speech where people are like, look, Pharaoh can do anything to us. And Moses says to the people who are enslaved by Pharaoh, he says, yeah, Pharaoh can even kill you, but Pharaoh cannot take away your faith. And that is not a Hallmark card. That is not a throwaway line. It has real implications for people's lived experiences. Those who are actually trying to live faithful Christian lives experience this every day. It's why we revere and study martyrs, because they have experienced, I would say, the perfection of that reality. And you may ask, like, what does this have to do with reading the Bible, right? Like, what does this have to do with studying the historical context of this ancient text? But it has everything to do with reading the Bible. Because in that place of submission to God, we can actually experience a real encounter with the text of the Word of God. A real encounter that is not stomping our feet and insisting that everything it says literally happened, and is also not stomping our feet and insisting that this is a book like any other and we should just take it that way. It puts us in a position of actually being able to hear what the Spirit is saying today to us through this text, to understand that our ancestors passed it down to us for very good reason, that we're standing on the shoulders of giants. We may be able to see further with all our highfalutin scientific ideas, which I accept as true, but we wouldn't be here without them. Without their curiosity, and yes, their creativity, and without their love. If there is something that I think Protestantism, this sort of hyper-reform Protestantism that is sola scriptura, everything has to come from the Bible, there's one thing that I think they're missing the most. It's ancestors. It's saints, it's martyrs, it's apostles, it's grandparents who have wrestled with these questions before us. These are not new questions. These aren't new ideas. Origen did not think that we were supposed to take the creation narrative literally. That's like almost 2,000 years ago. And when we lose sight of the traditional, when we lose sight of the church tradition that is one of the legs of our Anglican three-legged stool, right? When we lose sight of that, the Bible becomes something very stale and dry and, unfortunately, in the wrong hands, terrifying. That I will critique from a moral high ground, because human powers are corrupting. But I can only do that if I commit myself to submission to God.